Right, welcome back. We started to book a series of unfortunate events, the bad beginning. Um, book started off pretty bad. We met the Baudelaire children, Violet, Klaus, Sunny, and they got bad news at the very beginning of the book where their house caught fire, burnt down, and their parents died in the fire. So then they had to go, which makes them orphans. And then they went and lived with the banker, Mr. Poe, which they hated living there. The room they stayed in was with two other kids, and it smelled, and the mom bought them horrible clothes because they didn't have any anymore, and they never got to see Mr. Poe, which was the only person they knew. But then he found them a new place to live, and that's at Count Olaf, who is a weird-looking guy with the eyes all over his house and on his tattooed on his leg, one eyebrow, and he's kind of mean, and they think he's kind of evil. Puts him in a room with really nothing. But next door neighbors, Justice Strauss, who they like, nice lady, nice house, library, so they feel like they can go read. When we stopped, Count Olaf had ordered the kids to make dinner for him and his theater troupe, and they had no cookbook, so they went to Justice Strauss, found a recipe for puttanesca, which is sauteed olives, capers, anchovies, parsley, and you serve that with spaghetti sauce or spaghetti dried noodles, that sauce. So that's where we left off. They were happier. They felt like they could be happy as long as Justice Strauss was next door and they could go over there and get books. But we'll see, because it's a series of unfortunate events, which means not good, not a series of, well, one bad thing happens, everything is better events. Chapter 4. The Baudelaire orphans copied the puttanesca recipe from the cookbook onto a piece of scrap paper, and Justice Strauss was kind enough to escort them to the market to buy the necessary ingredients. Count Olaf had not left them very much money, but the children were able to buy everything they needed. From a street vendor, they purchased olives after tasting several varieties and choosing their favorites. At the pasta store, they selected interesting shaped noodles and asked the woman running the store the proper amount for 13 people. The 10 people Count Olaf mentioned, and the 3 of them. Then, at the supermarket, they purchased garlic, which is a sharp-tasting bulbous plant, anchovies, which are small, salty fish, capers, which are the flower buds of a small shrub and taste marvelous, and tomatoes, which are actually fruits, not vegetables, as most people believe. They thought it would be proper to serve dessert, and bought several envelopes of pudding mix. Perhaps, the orphans thought, if they made a delicious meal, Count Olaf might be a bit kinder to them. "Thank you so much for helping us out today," Violet said, as she and her siblings walked home with Justice Strauss. "I don't know what we would have done without you." "You seem like very intelligent people," Justice Strauss said. "I dare say you would have thought of something. But it continues to strike me as odd that Count Olaf has asked you to prepare such an enormous meal. Well, here we are. I must go inside and put my own groceries away. I hope you children will come over soon and borrow books from my library." "Tomorrow?" Klaus said quickly. "Could we come over tomorrow?" "I don't see why not," Justice Strauss said, smiling. "I can't tell you how much we appreciate this," Violet said carefully. With their kind parents dead and Count Olaf treating them so abominably, the 3 children were not used to kindness from adults and weren't sure if they were expected to do anything back. "Tomorrow, before we use your library again, Klaus and I would be more than happy to do household chores for you. Sunny isn't really old enough to work, but I'm sure we could find some way she could help too." Justice Strauss smiled at the 3 children, but her eyes were sad. She reached out a hand and put it on Violet's hair, and Violet felt more comforted than she had in some time. "That won't be necessary," Justice Strauss said. "You are always welcome in my home." Then she turned and went into her home, and after a moment of staring after her, the Baudelaire orphans went into theirs. For most of the afternoon, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny cooked the puttanesca sauce according to the recipe. Violet roasted the garlic and washed and chopped the anchovies. Klaus peeled the tomatoes and pitted the olives. Sunny banged on a pot with a wooden spoon, singing a rather repetitive song that she had written herself. All 3 of the children felt less miserable than they had since their arrival at Count Olaf's. The smell of cooking food is often a calming one, and its kitchen grew cozy as the sauce simmered, a culinary term which means cook over low heat. The 3 orphans spoke of pleasant memories of their parents about Justice Strauss, who they agreed was a wonderful neighbor and whose library they planned to spend a great deal of time. As they talked, they mixed and tasted the chocolate pudding. Just as they were placing the pudding in the refrigerator to cool, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny heard a loud booming sound as the front door was flung open, and I'm sure I don't have to tell you who was home. Orphans! Count Olaf called out in a scratchy voice. Where are you, orphans? In the kitchen, Count Olaf, Klaus called. Or just finishing dinner. You better be, Count Olaf said, and strode into the kitchen. He gazed at all three Baudelaire children with shiny, shiny eyes. My troop is right behind me, and they are very hungry. Where's the roast beef? We didn't make roast beef, Violet said. We made puttanesca sauce. What? Count Olaf asked. No roast beef? You didn't tell us you wanted roast beef, Klaus said. Count Olaf slid towards the children so he looked even taller than he was. His eyes grew even brighter, and his one eyebrow raised in anger. In agreeing to adopt you, he said, I have become your father, and as your father, I am not someone to be trifled with. I demand that you serve roast beef to myself and my guest. We don't have any, Violet cried. We made puttanesca. No, 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 Sunny shouted. Count Olaf looked down at Sunny, who had spoken so suddenly. With an inhuman roar, he picked her up in one scraggy hand and raised her so she was staring at him in the eye. Needless to say, Sunny was frightened and began crying immediately, too scared to even try to bite the hand that held her. Put her down immediately, you beast, Klaus shouted. He jumped up, trying to rescue Sunny from the grasp of the Count, but he was holding her too high to reach. Count Olaf looked down at Klaus and smiled a terrible toothy grin, raising the wailing Sunny up even higher in the air. He seemed about to drop her to the floor when there was a large burst of laughter in the next room. Olaf! Where's Olaf? Voices called out. Count Olaf paused, still holding the wailing Sunny up in the air, as the member of the theater troupe walked into the kitchen. Soon they were crowding the room, an assortment of strange-looking characters of all shapes and sizes. There was a bald man with a very long nose, dressed in a long black robe. There were two women who had bright white powder all over their faces, making them look like ghosts. Behind the women was a man with very long and skinny arms, at the end of which were two hooks instead of hands. There was a person who was extremely fat, and who looked like neither a man nor a woman, and behind this person, standing in the doorway, were an assortment of people and their children. Of people the children could not see, but who promised to be just as frightening. Here you are, Olaf, said one of the white-faced women. What in the world are you doing? I'm just disciplining these orphans, Count Olaf said. I asked them to make dinner, and all they have made is some disgusting sauce. Can't go easy on children, the man at the hook hand said. They must be taught to obey their elders. The tall, bald man peered at the youngsters. Are these, he said to Count Olaf, those wealthy children you were telling us about? Yes, Count Olaf said. They are so awful I can scarcely stand to touch them. With that, he lowered Sunny, who was still wailing, to the floor, and Klaus and Violet breathed a sigh of relief that he had not dropped her from that great height. I don't blame you, said someone in the doorway. Count Olaf rubbed his hands together as if he'd been holding something revolting instead of an infant. Well, enough talk, he said. I suppose we will eat their dinner, even though it is all wrong. Everyone, follow me to the dining room, and I will pour us some wine. Perhaps by the time these brats serve us, we will be too drunk to care if it's roast beef or not. Hurrah! Cried several members of the troop, and they marched through the kitchen, following Count Olaf into the dining room. Nobody paid a bit of attention to the children, except for the bald man, who stopped and stared Violet in the eye. You're a pretty one, he said, taking her face in his rough hands. If I were you, I would try not to anger Count Olaf, or he might wreck that pretty little face of yours. Violet shuddered, and the bald man gave a high-pitched giggle and left the room. The Baudelaire children, alone in the kitchen, found themselves breathing heavily, as they had just run a long distance. Sunny continued to wail, and Klaus found that his eyes were wet with tears as well. Only Violet didn't cry, but merely trembled with fear and revulsion, a word here which means unpleasant mixture of horror and disgust. For several moments, none of them could speak. This is terrible, terrible, Klaus said finally. Violet, what can we do? I don't know, she said. I'm afraid. Me too, Klaus said. Hux, Sunny said as she stopped crying. Let's have some dinner, someone shouted from the dining room, and the theater began pounding on the table in strict rhythm, which is an exceedingly rude thing to do. We'd better serve the puttanesca, Klaus said. Who knows what Count Olaf will do to us? Violet thought of what the bald man had said about the wrecking her face, and nodded. The two of them looked at the pot of bubbling sauce, which had seemed so cozy while they were making it, and now looked like a vat of blood. Then, leaving Sonny behind in the kitchen, they walked into the dining room. Klaus carrying the bowl of interesting shaped noodles, and Violet carrying the pot of puttanesca sauce and a large ladle to which to serve it. The theater troupe was talking and cackling, drinking again and again from their wine cups and paying no attention to the Baudelaire orphans as they circled the table, serving everyone dinner. Violet's right hand ached from holding the heavy ladle. She thought of switching to her left hand, but because she was right-handed, she was afraid she might spill the sauce with her left hand, which could enrage Count Olaf again. She stared miserably at Olaf's plate of food and found herself wishing she had bought poison at the market and put it in the puttanesca sauce. Finally, they were through serving, and Klaus and Violet slipped back into the kitchen. They listened to the wild, rough laughter of Count Olaf and his theater troupe, and they picked at their own portion of food, too miserable to eat. Before long, Olaf's friends were pounding on the table in strict rhythm again, and the orphans went out to the dining room to clear the table, and then again to serve the chocolate pudding. By now, it was obvious that Count Olaf and his associates had drunk a great deal of wine, and they slouched at the table, spoke much less. Finally, they roused themselves and trooped back through the kitchen, scarcely glancing at the children on their way out of the house. Count Olaf looked around the room, which was filled with dirty dishes. "Because you haven't cleaned up yet," he said to the orphans, "I suppose you can be excused from attending tonight's performance, but after cleaning up, you are to go straight to bed." Klaus had been glaring at the floor, trying to hide how upset he was. But at this, he could not remain silent. "You mean our bed?" he shouted. "You have only provided us with one bed." A member of the theater troupe stopped in their track at this outburst and glanced from Klaus to Count Olaf to see what would happen. Count Olaf raised his one eyebrow, and his eyes shone bright, but he spoke calmly. "If you would like another bed," he said, "tomorrow you may go into town and purchase one." "You know perfectly well we haven't any money," Klaus said. "Of course you do," Count Olaf said, and his voice began to get a little louder. "You're the inheritors of an enormous fortune." "That money," Klaus said, remember what Mr. Poe said, "is not to be used until Violet is of age." Count Olaf's face grew very red. For a moment he said nothing. Then in one sudden movement, he reached down and struck Klaus across the face. Klaus fell to the floor, his face inches from the eye tattooed on Olaf's ankle. His glasses leaped from his face and skittered into a corner. His left cheek, where Olaf had struck him, felt as if it was on fire. The theater troupe laughed, and a few of them applauded as if Count Olaf had done something very brave, instead of something despicable. "Come on, friends," Count Olaf said to his comrades. "We'll be late for our own performance." "And if I know you, Olaf," said the man with the hooked hands, "you'll figure out a way to get at that Baudelaire money." "We'll see," Count Olaf said, but his eyes were shining bright as if he had already had an idea. There was another loud boom at the front door. As the front door shut behind Count Olaf and his terrible friends and the Baudelaire children were alone in the kitchen. Violet knelt at Klaus's side, giving him a hug to try to make him feel better. Sonny crawled over to his glasses, picked them up, and brought them to him. Klaus began to sob, not so much from the pain, but from the rage at the terrible situation they were in. Violet and Sonny cried with him, and they continued weeping as they washed the dishes, as they blew out the candles in the dining room, and as they changed out their clothes and laid down to go to sleep. Klaus in the bed, Violet on the floor, Sonny on her little cushion of curtain. The moonlight shone through the window, and if anyone had looked into the Baudelaire orphan's bedroom, they would have seen 3 children crying quietly all night. Okay. So they made the puttanesca sauce, made them happy, smelled great, which if you've ever smelled a tomato-based puttanesca sauce, you do know it does smell great. But how'd their day continue? It started to get worse again. Right down. They were happy, and then Count Olaf came back, demanded that they should have made roast beef. They should have known that. They said, "We had this." His theater troupe came, and they were a bunch of scary people, as was described in the book. And then they said, "Okay, we'll eat your awful sauce." So they ate the sauce. They ate the pudding. They drank a lot of wine. What 2 things did Count Olaf do in this chapter that just showed how bad he actually is as a person? Well, the one he held Sonny up above his head, which, if you know babies, they don't like that, and it's actually really dangerous. And the other, he smacked Klaus across the face, which is also not a good thing. So, that high point that the Baudelaire Orphans was at by going to Justice Strauss's house and getting the book and going shopping with her and her telling he can come over, kind of just crashed in that chapter. Just one chapter caused it to crash. So, but we'll continue with chapter 5. Unless you've been very, very lucky, you have undoubtedly experienced events in your life that have made you cry. So unless you have been very, very lucky, you know that a good long session of weeping can often make you feel better, even if your circumstances have not changed one bit. So it was with the Baudelaire orphans. Having cried all night, they rose the next morning feeling as if there was a weight off their shoulders. The 3 children knew, of course, that they were still in a terrible situation, but they thought they might do something to make it better. The morning's note from Count Olaf ordered them to chop firewood in the backyard, and as Violet and Klaus swung the axe down over each log to break it into smaller pieces, they discussed possible plans of action, while Sonny chewed meditatively on a small piece of wood. Clearly, Klaus said, fingering the ugly bruise on his face where Olaf had struck him, we cannot stay here any longer. I'd rather take my chances on the street than live in this terrible place. But who knows what misfortunes would befall us on the streets, Violet pointed out. And at least here we have a roof over our heads. I wish our parents' money could be used now instead of when you come of age, Klaus said. Then we could buy a castle and live in it, with armed guards patrolling outside to keep out Count Olaf and his troop. And I could have a large inventing studio, Klaus said wistfully. She swung the axe down and split a log neatly in 2, filled with gears and pulleys and wires and an elaborate computer system. And I could have a large library, Klaus said, as comfortable as Justice Strauss's, but more enormous. Gibbo, Sonny shrieked. She appeared to mean, and I could have a lot of things to bite. But in the meantime, Violet said, we have to do something about our predicament. Perhaps Justice Strauss could adopt us, Klaus said. So she said we were always welcome in her home. She meant for a visit or to use her library, Violet pointed out. She didn't mean to live. Perhaps if we explained our situation to her, she would agree to adopt us, Klaus said hopefully. But when Violet looked at him, she saw that he knew it was of no use. Adoption is an enormous decision and not likely to happen impulsively. I'm sure you, in your life, have occasionally wished to be raised by different people than the ones who are raising you, but knew in your heart that the chances of this were very slim. I think we should go see Mr. Poe, Violet said. He told us when he dropped us off that we could contact him at the bank if we had any questions. We don't really have a question, Klaus said. We have a complaint. He was thinking of Mr. Poe walking towards them at the briny beach with his terrible message. Even though the fire was, of course, not Mr. Poe's fault, Klaus was reluctant to see Mr. Poe because he was afraid of getting more bad news. I can't think of anyone else to contact, Violet said. Mr. Poe's in charge of our affairs, and I'm sure if he knew how horrid Count Olaf is, he would take us right out of here. Klaus pictured Mr. Poe arriving in his car and putting the Baudelaire orphans inside to go somewhere else and felt a stirring of hope. Anywhere could be better than here. Okay, he said. Let's get this firewood all chopped and we'll go to the bank. Invigorated by their plan, the Baudelaire orphans swung their axes at an amazing speed, and soon enough they were done chopping firewood and ready to go to the bank. They remembered Count Olaf saying he had a map of the city, and they looked thoroughly for it, but they couldn't find any trace of a map and decided to be in a tower where they were forbidden to go. So without directions of any sort, the Baudelaire children set off for the city's banking district in hope of finding Mr. Poe. After working through the meat district, the flower district, and the sculpture district, the 3 children arrived at the banking district, pausing to take a refreshing sip of water at the fountains of Victoria's Finance. The banking district consisted of several wide streets with large marble buildings on each side of them, all banks. They went first to Trustworthy Bank, and then to Faithful Saving and Loan, and then to Subservient Financial Services, each time inquiring for Mr. Poe. Finally, a receptionist at Subservient said she knew that Mr. Poe worked down the street at Mortuary Money Management. The building was square and rather plain-looking, though once inside, the 3 orphans were intimidated by the hustle and bustle of the people as they raced around the large echoey room. Finally, they asked a uniformed guard whether they had arrived at the right place to speak to Mr. Poe. and he led them into a large office with many file cabinets and no windows. "Why, hello," said Mr. Poe in a puzzled tone. He was sitting at a desk covered in typed papers that looked important and boring. Surrounding a small framed photograph of his wife and his two beastly sons were 3 telephones with flashing lights. "Please come in." "Thank you," said Klaus, shaking Mr. Poe's hand. The Baudelaire youngsters sat down in the 3 large and comfortable chairs. Mr. Poe opened his mouth to speak, but he had to cough into a handkerchief before he could begin. "I'm very busy today," he said finally, "so I don't have much time to chat. Next time you should call ahead of time when you plan on being in the neighborhood, and I will put some time aside for you to take you to lunch." "That would be very pleasant," Violet said, "and we're sorry we didn't contact you before we stopped by, but we find ourselves in an urgent situation." "Count Olaf is a madman," Klaus said, getting to the point. "We cannot stay with him." He struck Klaus across the face, she said. "Across the face. See his bruise?" Violet said. But just as she said it, one of the telephone rings in a loud, unpleasant wail. "Excuse me," Mr. Poe said, and he picked up the phone. "Poe here," he said to the receiver. "Yes." "What?" "Yes. Yes. Yes. No. Yes." At the Baudelaire's, as if he had forgotten they were there. "I'm sorry, Mr. Poe. What were we talking about?" "Oh, yes, Count Olaf. I'm sorry you don't have a good first impression of him." "He has only provided us with one bed," Klaus said. "He makes us do a great many difficult chores. He drinks too much wine." "Excuse me," Mr. Poe said as another telephone rang. "Poe here," he said. 7, 7, 7, 7, 6.5, 7. "You're welcome." He hung up and quickly wrote something down on the paper and then looked at the children. "I'm sorry," he said. "What were you saying about Count Olaf making you do chores? Doesn't sound too bad. He calls us orphans. He has terrible friends. He's always asking about our money." "Poco." This was from Sonny. Mr. Poe put his hands in to indicate he had heard enough. "Children, children," he said. "You must give yourselves time to adjust to your new home. You've only been there a few days." "We have been there long enough to know Count Olaf is a madman," Klaus said. Mr. Poe sighed and looked at each of the 3 children. His face was kind, but it didn't look like he really believed what the Baudelaire orphans were saying. Are you familiar with the Latin term in loco parentis?" he asked. Violet and Sonny looked at Klaus, the biggest reader of the 3. He was the most likely to know vocabulary words and foreign phrases. "Something about trains?" he asked. Maybe Mr. Poe is going to take them by train to another relative." Mr. Poe shook his head. "In loco parentis means acting in the role of a parent," he said. "It is a legal term and applies to Count Olaf. Now that you are in his care, the Count may raise you using any methods he sees fit. I'm sorry if your parents did not make you do any household chores, or if you never saw them drink any wine, or if you like their friends better than Count Olaf's friends. But these are things that you must get used to, as Count Olaf is acting in loco parentis. Understand?" "But he struck my brother," Violet said. "Look at his face." As Violet spoke, Mr. Poe reached into his pocket for a handkerchief, covering his mouth, and coughed many, many times into it. He coughed loud enough that Violet could not be certain he had heard her. "Whatever Count Olaf has done," Mr. Poe said, glancing down at one of his papers and circling a number, "he has acted in poco parentis, and there's nothing I can do about it. Your money will be protected by myself and by the bank, but Count Olaf's parenting techniques are his own business. Now, I hate to usher you out of post haste, but I have to. Very much work to do." The children just sat there stunned. Mr. Poe looked up and cleared his throat. "Post haste," he said, means you'll do nothing to help us," Violet finished it for him. She was shaking with anger and frustration. As one of the phones began ringing, she stood up, walked out of the room, followed by Klaus, who was carrying Sonny. They stalked out of the bank and stood on the street, not knowing what to do next. "What shall we do next?" Klaus asked sadly. Violet stared up at the sky. She wished she could invent something that could take them out of here. "It's getting a bit late," she said. "We might as well go back and think of something else for tomorrow. Perhaps we can stop and see Justice Strauss." "But you said she wouldn't help us," Klaus said. "Not for help," Violet said. "For books. It's very useful when one is young to learn the difference between literally and figuratively. If something happens literally, it actually happens. If something happens figuratively, it feels like it's happening. If you are literally jumping for joy, for instance, it means you are leaping in the air because you are very happy. If you are figuratively jumping for joy, it means you are happy, that you are so happy that you could jump for joy, but you are saving your energy for other matters." The Baudelaire orphans walked back to Count Olaf's neighborhood and stopped at the home of Justice Strauss, who welcomed them inside and let them choose books from the library. Violet chose several books about mechanical inventions. Klaus chose several about wolves, and Sonny found a book with many pictures of teeth inside. Then they went to their room, crowded together on one bed, and reading intently and happily. Figuratively, they escaped from Count Olaf and their miserable existence. They did not literally escape, because they were still in the house and vulnerable to Olaf's evil in loco parentis ways. But by immersing themselves in their favorite reading topics, they felt far away from their predicament, as if they had escaped. In the situation of the orphans, figuratively, escaping was not enough, of course, but at the end of the tiring and hopeless day, it would have to do. Violet and Klaus and Sonny read their books, and in the back of their minds, they hoped that soon their figurative escape would eventually turn into a literal one. All right, that's the end of that chapter. So they went to the bank, talked to Mr. Poe. They were going to ask him for help. What was his answer? He said there was nothing he could do. Him and the bank would protect the money. They couldn't do anything else. He used the term in loco parentis, which was Latin for what? Acting in place of the parents. So however Count Olaf chooses to raise them, whatever he does in his home is his thing. He has no place in it. That includes hitting Klaus, which is kind of a strange thing for someone to say, because most of the time you'd think. But they get a little bit happier after visiting Mr. Poe because they did what? Stopped and picked up books from Justice Strauss. Then what goes into the whole figurative, they figuratively escaped. They felt distant from what their situation was, but literally they were still in a bad situation. All right, so can it get worse? I guess we'll find out. Chapter 6. The next morning, when the children stumbled sleepily from their bedroom into the kitchen, rather than a note from Count Olaf, they found Count Olaf himself. "Good morning, orphans," he said. "I have your oatmeal all ready in bowls for you." Their children took seats at the kitchen table and stared nervously into their oatmeal. If you knew Count Olaf and he suddenly served you a meal, wouldn't you be afraid there was something terrible in it, like poisoned or ground glass? But instead, Violet, Klaus, and Sonny found fresh raspberries had been sprinkled on top of each of their portions. The Baudelaire orphans hadn't had raspberries since their parents died, although they were extremely fond of them. "Thank you," Klaus said, carefully picking up one of the raspberries and examining it. Perhaps there was poisoned berries that just looked like delicious ones. Count Olaf, seeing how suspiciously Klaus was looking at the berries, smiled and plucked a berry out of Sonny's bowl. Looking at each of the three youngsters, he popped it into his mouth and ate it. "Aren't raspberries delicious?" he asked. "They were my favorite berries when I was your age." Violet tried to picture Count Olaf as a youngster, but couldn't. His shiny eyes, bony hands, and shadowy smile all seemed to be the things only adults possess. Despite her fear of him, however, she took her spoon in her right hand and began to eat her oatmeal. Count Olaf had eaten some, so it probably wasn't poisonous, and anyway, she was very hungry. Klaus began to eat too, as did Sonny, who got oatmeal and raspberry all over her face. "I received a phone call yesterday," Count Olaf said, "from Mr. Poe. He told me you children had been to see him." The children exchanged glances. They had hoped their visit would be taken into confidence, a phrase which here means kept a secret between Mr. Poe and themselves and not babbled to Count Olaf. "Mr. Poe told me," Count Olaf said, "that you appeared to be having difficulty adjusting to the life I have so graciously provided for you, and I'm very sorry to hear that." The children looked at Count Olaf. His face was very serious, as if he were very sorry to hear that, but his eyes were shining and bright, the way they are when someone is telling a joke. "Is that so?" Violet said. "I'm sorry Mr. Poe bothered you." "I'm glad he did," Count Olaf said, "because I want the three of you to feel at home here, now that I am your father." Children shuddered a little at that, remembering their own kind father and gazing sadly at the poor substitute sitting across the table from them. Lately, Count Olaf said, I've been very nervous about my performances in the theater troupe, and I'm afraid I may have to act a bit standoffish. The word standoffish is a wonderful one, but it does not describe Count Olaf's behavior towards children. It means reluctant to associate with others, and it might describe somebody who, during a party, would stand in the corner and not talk to anyone. It would not describe somebody who provides one bed for 3 people to sleep in, forces them to do horrible chores, and strikes them across the face. There are many words for people like that, but standoffish is not one of them. Klaus knew the word standoffish and almost laughed out loud at Olaf's incorrect use of it, but his face still had a bruise on it, so Klaus remained silent. Therefore, to make you feel a little more at home here, I would like to have you participate in my next play. Perhaps if you took part in the work I do, you'd be less likely to run off complaining to Mr. Poe. In what way would we participate? Violet asked. She was thinking of all the chores they had already did for Count Olaf and was not in the mood to do more. Well, Count Olaf said, and his eyes shining brightly, the play is called The Marvelous Marriage. It is written by the great playwright Al Funkut. We will give only one performance on this Friday night. It is about a man who is very brave and intelligent, played by me. In the finale, he marries the young, beautiful woman he loves in front of the cheering people. You, Klaus, and you, Sonny. We'll play some of the cheering people in the crowd. But we're shorter than most adults, Klaus said. Won't that look strange to the audience? You will be playing 2 midgets who attend the wedding, Olaf said patiently. And what will I do? Violet asked. I am very handy with tools, so perhaps I can build you a set. Build the set? Heavens no, Count Olaf said. A pretty girl like you shouldn't be working backstage. But I'd like to, Violet said. Count Olaf's one eyebrow raised slightly, and the Baudelaire orphans recognized this sign of his anger. But then the eyebrow went down again as he forced himself to remain calm. But I have such an important role for you on stage, he said. You are going to play the young woman I marry. Violet felt her oatmeal and raspberries shift around in her stomach as if she just caught the flu. It was bad enough having Count Olaf acting in loco parentis, announcing himself as their father, but to consider this man her husband, even for the purposes of a play, was even more dreadful. It is very important role, he continued, his mouth curling into an unconvincing smile, although you have no lines other than I do, which you will say when Justice Strauss asks you if you will have me. Justice Strauss, Violet said. What does she have to do with it? She has agreed to play the part of the judge, Count Olaf said. Behind him, one of the eyes painted on the kitchen wall slowly watched over each of the Baudelaire children. I asked Justice Strauss to participate because I wanted to be neighborly as well as fatherly. Count Olaf, Violet said, and then stopped herself. She wanted to argue her way out of playing the bride, but she didn't want to make him angry. Father, she said, I'm not sure I'm talented enough to perform professionally. I would hate to disgrace your good name and the name of Al Funkut. Plus, I'll be very busy in the next few days working on my inventions and learning how to prepare roast beef. She added quickly, remembering how he had behaved after about dinner. Count Olaf reached out with one of his spidery hands and stroked Violet on the chin, looking deep into her eyes. You will, he said, participate in this theatrical performance. I would prefer it if you would participate voluntarily, but I believe Mr. Poe explained to you that I can order you to participate, and you must obey. Olaf's sharp and dirty fingers gently scratched on Violet's chin, and she shivered. The room was very, very quiet. As Olaf finally let go and stood up and left without a word, the Baudelaire children listened to their heavy footsteps go up the stairs to the tower they were forbidden to enter. Well, Klaus said hesitantly, I guess it won't hurt to be in the play. It seems to be very important to him, and we want to keep on his good side. But he must be up to something, Violet said. You don't think those berries were poisoned, do you? Klaus asked worriedly. No, Violet said. Olaf is after the fortune we will inherit. Killing us would do us no good. But what good does it to him to have us in his stupid play? I don't know, Violet said, admitted miserably. Ooh. She stood up and started washing out the oatmeal bowls. I wish we knew something more about inheritance laws, Klaus said. I'll bet Count Olaf has cooked up some plan to get our money, but I don't know what it could be. Guess we could ask Mr. Poe about it, Violet said doubtfully as Klaus stood beside her and dried the dishes. He knows all those Latin legal phrases, but Mr. Poe would probably call Count Olaf again, and then he'd know what we're on to him. Klaus pointed out, maybe we should try to talk to Justice Strauss. She's a judge, so she might know about the law. But she's also Olaf's neighbor, Violet replied, and she might tell him that we had asked. Klaus took his glasses off, which he often did when he was thinking hard. How could we find out about the law without Olaf's knowledge? Book, Sonny shouted suddenly. She probably meant something like, would somebody please wipe my face, but it made Violet and Klaus look at each other. Book. They were both thinking the same thing. Surely Justice Strauss would have the book on inheritance law. Count Olaf didn't leave us any chores to do, Violet said, so I suppose we are free to visit Count Justice Strauss in her library. Klaus smiled. Yes, indeed, he said. And today I don't think I'll choose a book on wolves. Nor I, Violet said, on mechanical engineering. I think I'd like to read about inheritance law. Well, let's go, Klaus said. Justice Strauss said we could come over soon, and we don't want to be standoffish. At the mention of the word that Count Olaf had used so ridiculously, the Baudelaire orphans all laughed, even Sonny, who of course did not have a very big vocabulary. Swiftly they put away the clean oatmeal bowls in the kitchen cupboards, which watched them with painted eyes. Then the three people that ran next door. Friday, the day of the performance, was only a few days off, and the children wanted to figure out Count Olaf's plan as quickly as possible. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. So, Mr. Poe told Count Olaf that he talked to him, and Count Olaf made breakfast for the kids. What did he talk about? How was he going to be more friendly to the kids? He was going to take part in his next play called The Marvelous Marriage by Al Funcoot. And Sonny and Klaus are going to play midgets in the crowd so they can cheer for the wedding. What was Violet's role? She was going to be the bride. She didn't want to do it, but she was. And who was the other person, surprisingly, that was going to be in the play with them? Yeah, Justice Strauss. And Klaus found this all kind of strange, and he just figured out that this has something to do with their family money. So they went and got inherited law books from Justice Strauss. So nobody could call and tell Count Olaf what they were doing. That's where we're going to stop today. We will continue to see if it gets better or if it actually gets worse next time.